Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Stephen Waldron. Stephen has studied theology for several years, most recently finishing up a PhD at Boston University before becoming a research fellow at Notre Dame. He spent a lot of time in both conservative and progressive church contexts, which has inspired his research on topics like polarization, gender, and democracy. He's passionate about figuring out how to build understanding across ideological lines without assuming that people will come to a consensus, and also without compromising his own progressive values about basic human dignity. Scripturally speaking, he's inspired by the commandment against bearing false witness against one's neighbor. Here are some of the specific research projects that he's had. Number one, using moral psychology research to understand the roles of moral concepts in Christian theological disagreements. Number two, how the new apostolic reformation, a militant sector of independent charismatic Christianity, is changing democracy in the United States today. And number three, the role of patriarchal theologies of gender in post-liberal forms of conservative ideology like the National Conservative Movement that J.D. Vance is largely affiliated with. You can learn more about Stephen and all of his work at stephenwaldron.substack.com. And that's Stephen with a PH, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, W-A-L-D-R-O-N substack.com. So Stephen, thanks so much for joining us and congratulations on all of your very interesting work.
Thanks, Brian. And yeah, I apologize for all the big words and the descriptions of my work, but yeah, apostolic and patriarchal, and I'll have to find smaller words at some point for some of those things maybe.
No, they're fine words. I just mispronounce them some of the time. Is there anything else that you want people to know about you than what I touched on there?
Yeah, I'll just briefly mention that personally, as you mentioned, I'm living in Indiana this year with my wife and son here in South Bend, and in the early stages of academic life. So just finished my PhD in May. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So how did you get involved in doing the type of work that you're involved with? It's, you know, not common, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think for a lot of academics, similarly to me, there's kind of a thread you pull on, then you keep pulling on the thread and going further and further along with certain things. So for my dissertation work, I did a lot of the work with moral psychology and trying to see how that can help to interpret theology and the way that people differ about theological views. And, it was initially just an instinct. Maybe that's somewhere to look because the moral psychologists were talking about, oh, religion's impacted by this stuff too, but the theologians in general have not been talking that way or thinking about that. So as I pulled on that thread, I started to see, oh, this could be really useful for thinking through why exactly Christians have vastly different perspectives in many cases, especially in the United States right now, about not just moral and political issues, but also theological issues. So people might have a different idea of, for example, what atonement means or should mean in a Christian context. So is it something based in, say, God's justice based around fairness, or is it something more about divine care and caring for the good creation? And you can have very different perspectives on a theological issue like that I think are grounded in some of our basic moral instincts and how we use those in different ways.
Interesting. So are there any current research projects that you'd like to, share a little more depth with us about?
Yeah, so my current project is the one on the New Apostolic Reformation, or some people call it the NAR for short. And my project is on its political theology and how it impacts how the people in this charismatic movement that is very influential in a lot of ways, even though it's also a network that's, not clearly organized in a way that we recognize. It's not like, the Southern Baptist Convention where you can say, oh, there's 14 million people affiliated with this thing. Instead, it's a more diffuse network that also has a lot of political influence at the moment. So you might see those pictures of Donald Trump with all the people laying hands on him. And, a lot of people, even who are familiar with, say, the religious right, they look at those pictures and like, who are these people, right? But a lot of them, they're, black pastors, there's women pastors. And a lot of these people are from this large group of independent charismatic ministers and networks of ministry across the U.S. right now. that haven't traditionally been involved in politics, but then you see them having this influence largely through Trump's pastor, Paula White, who is
Hmm.
based in Florida. So the New Apostolic Reformation is a set of ideas that goes back to this guy, Peter Wagner, who was based in Los Angeles, California, taught in Fuller Seminary for quite a few decades,
Hmm.
and has influenced a lot of these people, especially Paula White and others, in how they view their political engagement. So my project's to take a step back and say, what's this set of ideas and what's it responding to that in some cases I think can be compelling. So I'll just give one example of that. One of their big emphases is bringing back the kingdom of God in Christian theology that, especially in more conservative evangelical theologies, it had been sort of let go of for a long time. People weren't talking about it. And I think it's commendable that they're doing that, even if I think the framework for how they understand the kingdom of God can be critiqued, and I definitely have critiques of that. So I think it's good to show why this kind of theology is appealing, but at the same time, try to turn some of these ideas in a different direction that might be less harmful.
Hmm. So how was Peter Wagner's fit within Fuller?
So yeah, that's interesting. So part of what was going on there was he was part of the School of Missions, right? So he was on a side of it that was different than the theology side of Fuller
Hmm.
Seminary.
Hmm.
And the theologians there actually didn't like him very much for a lot of reasons. So one reason was he taught a course for several years there in the 1980s where the charismatic leader John Wimber would come in. Wagner invited him to basically teach the class, even though he had no real academic credentials. So Peter Wagner would stand at the back of the classroom, and John Wimber would be in the front of the classroom, doing miracles and explaining how to, give words of prophecy and perform healings. And the rest of the Fuller faculty, once they realized it was the most popular course at the seminary, were like, "What's going on here?" And it was, becoming nationally known. So they eventually clamped down on it, and Peter Wagner was pretty upset. And for a while, he actually thought about suing Fuller to reinstate it on academic freedom grounds.
Hmm.
But then later in life, Peter Wagner remarked that there probably won't be a Wagner building at Fuller Seminary anytime in the future.
Wow. So tell us about kind of the nuts and bolts a little bit of a research project like that. What are the actual activities that you engage in?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, a lot of people, when they hear that I'm, engaging with a currently popular movement, they think of it as sort of like anthropological research. Like I must be interviewing a lot of people, and I am, talking to some people who are involved in similar circles. But mainly what I'm doing is researching things that these people have written, right? So there's a whole trail. I mean, Peter Wagner wrote or edited a total of 76 books,
Hmm.
and a lot of the apostles and prophets around him are not shy, both in book form and online and videos, about saying basically every thought they ever have, right? So people like, for example, one of his mentees, Lance Wallnow, just has so many videos he puts out there constantly. I'm on his email list right now, and almost I think it's a couple times a week he'll have a new video about something either political or spiritual, and so there's no shortage of content.
So is there some specific conclusion that you're either aiming for or expecting out of this?
Yeah, so I'm looking at a few areas in particular. One is the theology of what's called dominion that the New Apostolic Reformation has. Is so a lot of people talk about dominion theology. There are different forms of dominion theology out there, and they have one specific one. Another area I'm looking at is their views on business and economics and how their political theology informs that. Another is their views of gender, another their views of education, and my overall claims about those things are that there's some themes that cut across them. One of them is the an extreme emphasis on personal agency, and not just of human beings, but supernatural agents. So this goes back to Peter Wagner's involvement, among others, in spiritual warfare during the 1980s and 90s.
Hmm. Hmm.
So basically, the way these groups think about politics, it's not just human beings doing things politically. It's angels and demons who are active in the world and can be influenced by prayer and all sorts of symbolic actions like doing so-called Jericho marches around political buildings and whatnot. So they conceive of the world in those terms of there are these angels and demons who are very active, which is something Paula White, I don't know if you might remember this 4 years ago, she got mocked for praying loudly that angels from Africa and angels from South America will come overturn the election in 2020 and such, but that's actually a pretty common theme among these groups that they believe that
Hmm.
these supernatural agents are active in politics, which is something I don't want to be. I don't like being harsh as a person, but I do think that that's really corrosive to politics to be saying that your political enemies are motivated by demons and such.
Yeah, really. Yeah. Well, crazy things going on in our country. Crazier and crazier each week. Um, so the reason why I found out about Stephen in the first place is because he was involved in an event. You attended a post-election panel discussion organized by our author friend Kristen Cobes-Dumais, who I follow and have interviewed before, and you wrote an excellent summary of that. Can you touch on the highlights of that?
Yeah, so I got invited to this event partly because this year, along with Kristen, we're both research fellows in the Center for Philosophy of Religion at Notre Dame this year. So Kristen, yeah, put on this event with all these leaders in various areas to basically assess where the election had gone. So there are, scholars, sociologists, theologians, nonprofit leaders in religion and democracy type work, and activists even who were assessing the election. And some of the big highlights I thought were, one sociologist, David Campbell, noted that a lot of things haven't changed at all with the 2024 election, right? So there are people who voted for Republicans who have always voted for Republicans, people who voted for Democrats who have always done that. So on a very basic, political science kind of level, not much has changed, right? There are some other big issues, though. And one thing that Matthew D. Taylor, another scholar who studies the New Apostolic Reformation, has had a recent book about that, mentioned was the potential for democratic backsliding. So we've looked at, governments around the world in, say, Hungary or Poland or Russia, where at one point there were free and fair elections, and then things start to challenge that if a party that gets voted into office starts to do away with things like fair elections or press freedoms and so on. And there are different scenarios for how that works out. Like in Poland, that was reversed after it began happening several years ago, whereas in Hungary, it's deepened over time. So that was, I think, one really important conclusion is that things could go multiple ways. And right now, I think we're seeing maybe some of the more unfortunate things happening so far and not enough pushback, but we'll see what happens in that regard. But then, there were some sort of deeper conclusions that some of the speakers there drew, one of which is that in the United States today, there's a lot of social disconnection, and that seems to be affecting our political life and the extent to which we can have a common political life if people are so disconnected and not part of civic organizations like they used to be, not part of church denominations like they used to be. So just to plug the New Apostolic Reformation thing again, one of the things that's going on there, even though they're networked, they're not typically part of traditional denominations. They're not part of churches that have membership roles where members participate in terms of a kind of, I would call it proto-civic life, like a way of learning to do politics in the context of a congregation that's slipping away in a lot of the United States today. So that's another negative thing, a lot of negative things, right? Another one is the educational divide in the U.S. So, about 65% or so of people in the US don't have a four-year college degree. And then, you can do the math, another smaller percent, 30-something percent do of adults have a four-year college degree. And there's increasing cultural divide between those two groups that is really impacting our politics in a lot of different ways. And it's not just people with a college degree vote for Democrats or don't, that sort of thing, but even within political parties, within the Republican Party, for instance, there's a growing cultural split there that is negatively impacting our common public life. Um, yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, it was a very, I wish I would have been able to attend it. I mean, it was a very fascinating discussion. Are there more of those planned?
No, it was really a one-time event that Kristen organized, not knowing what was going to happen with the election as well.
Mhm, mhm.
So it was, yeah, very interesting to see, it could have had a different tone depending on which way the election went, and it, was the way it was. But I think there was some degree of trepidation involved going into it anyhow, though, just that whichever way the election went, there would have been some negative things happening because of those deeper underlying issues. So, if Harris had won, there may have been some sort of political violence like there was 4 years ago. So, yeah, our problems aren't just about one election.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, or unfortunately, I'm not sure how to think about that. But um, back to the topic of, backsliding of democracy. Do you have any prognoses on which way we're gonna end up?
No, that's the short answer. Yeah, I don't know that I or maybe anyone is qualified at this point to really say much about what definitely will happen. I mean, I will say what definitely is happening is a lot of individuals and institutions are being harmed right now, and that's a very negative thing. And, one thing that is likely to happen but isn't certain yet is that those institutions in the long run will be damaged. So that's something we need to be working on right now if
Yeah,
you're in
no,
a
I think
place
it
to do
is already
that.
happening. I think it is already happening dramatically, even just within a few weeks here. Um, do you have any suggestions for us? Being, the type of person that's done the deep research that you have, and the rest of us haven't. What kinds of things should we be doing?
Mm. Yeah, so I'm not an activist at this point in my life, although I have a little bit of experience in the past, but mostly as a scholar who, I've studied some of the theology that went on during the 1930s in Europe and some of it being pro-fascist, right? I think one of the big issues that come up in a situation like ours where we might be in the early stages of some sort of authoritarianism is the notion of truth, right? And the fact that we're surrounded by all sorts of lies and all sorts of propaganda from many angles. So, in the 1930s in Europe, that sort of thing, it had to be mediated through print or radio. Today, we have just so many ways, especially through social media, that lies are being spread constantly. And I think one of the most harmful forms of lies that we need to be dealing with by, in the first case, not telling them, but also finding ways to respond to them are lies that are targeted against groups of people. So one thing that I found deeply disturbing, and I'm still disturbed that it seems like we've almost forgotten it, were the lies told about Haitians in Ohio last
Mm-hmm.
summer, right? And they were just, blatant lies that were started by local neo-Nazis in Ohio, actually, and that were repeated by, the vice presidential candidate at the time. And there's been nothing done about that in terms of any kind of repentance or turnaround by people who had spread those lies. And I think there's something deeply dangerous about not just lies that threaten people, but lies that threaten people and aren't overturned in any way, right? That just fester out there. And then people who tell those sorts of lies know that the next time they can get away with it, right? If they got away with it before.
No, no.
So as far as a practical suggestion for that, I guess I would say just if you're in a conversation with someone, one thing that I've found useful and other people have suggested this as well is to push back by asking where did you get that information, right? And figure out where the information's coming from exactly with lies like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you find any of the online, fact checker websites helpful?
I don't look at them personally, honestly. Yeah, but I'm sure they're useful. Yeah.
It seems to be. It seems to be. Um, so one of the topics of our series here is reading hope in trying times. Have you been reading anything that's kind of helped you get through all of this besides your, academic work?
Yeah, aside from reading the works of Peter Wagner and whatnot, which maybe hasn't been helpful in some ways,
Yeah.
some things I have found helpful. There was a book published in last October, by a couple of political scientists, Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum, called Ungoverning: The Attack on the Administrative State and the Politics of Chaos,
Hmm.
which basically laid out a roadmap of a lot of the things we've seen over recent weeks, right? That
Hmm.
there's a new style of politics going on in the US today that has happened in some other places. So they highlight uh, Venezuela under Chavez, where a strong sort of personal leader can basically try to dismantle the parts of our government that make life possible as we know it. And there are, specific kinds of lies and conspiracism that go into that. And in the long run, it's dangerous because even though we don't think of bureaucrats, for instance, often as a good thing, right? We're like, we want to get rid of bureaucrats, we want government to be more efficient. There are actually all sorts of checks and balances on the way our society as a whole runs. There's all kinds of service that those people are doing things like keeping planes in the air or preventing outbreaks of tuberculosis or AIDS from coming back, right? Or, I mean, vaccines, right? And at this point, those things are threatened. And I think that Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum have some really insightful things to say about what the problem is. And they have some indications of what might be done about it. Unfortunately, I don't. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. On a more spiritual level, I guess I'd say last fall I read, and I hadn't read James Baldwin before, but I read his short book, The Fire Next Time, right? And I find Baldwin extremely helpful in his moral and spiritual clarity. And I think,
really.
Yeah, a lot of that comes from his role as an outsider, right? Where he was, Black, he was gay, he was not religious by the time he was writing, right? So he's able to see these dynamics within Christianity, within Islam, as he experienced those kinds of religion around him, and also see what whiteness is in the United States in some really perceptive ways that I think aren't very easily dismissed because he really has a way of getting to the heart of the issue in a way that, I mean, a lot of people, when they talk about social justice issues around things like race, for instance, I mean, they might be saying things that are true, but in a more shallow way. But I think Baldwin really gets to the heart of things in some really helpful ways that we need today.
And what was the specific book that you mentioned?
The Fire Next Time. It's a
Fire
short nonfiction. Yeah.
Okay. I read some of his work, but I haven't read that one. So, what other kinds of practices do you find have been helpful for you in getting through all this?
Yeah. So my short quasi-joking answer would be writing, right? So, reading and writing, I guess. More seriously, as a Christian, I find it really helpful to keep attending church and keep taking communion every week. I found that to be a very grounding practice personally, and keep doing so in a context that in the church I'm attending right now, it's not overwhelmed by political issues in any way. Even though, I mean, the things come up, they're real things, but it's a reminder that there's this kind of more timeless thing going on and something I can be grounded in that isn't just affected by how things are swaying this way or that way in any given week.
Mm-hmm. So as you know, one of the platforms I lead is called Find Your Next Calling. And, it has to do with discernment, and kind of figuring out, what a person's call is at different stages of their life. What do you find is helpful for you to discern what's next?
Yeah, not to start with another joke, but I kind of think as an early career academic, I don't know how qualified I am to give advice on this because it's maybe not the wisest career path to be taking. But one thing that I have found helpful is something a friend of mine several years ago mentioned. He had read a book, and I don't remember the name of the book, about improv comedy and taking the yes and rule that they use in improv comedy as a way of guiding how you make decisions in your life. So always being open to new things. So, being open to talking with this guy, Brian, and being interviewed by him, or, being open to moving to Indiana to do research. So I found that helpful, even though obviously, there are things we should be saying no to in our lives, and there's a really important place for that. At the same time, there are a lot of things that might make us a little bit uncomfortable, but that aren't actually problematic and aren't going to have harmful consequences where I think we should just push ourselves to say yes. So that might go back to some of your earlier questions about, what can we do right now? I think there are things people could do in terms of maybe showing up if there's a protest somewhere or, making a call or several calls to congressional representatives that, if you're on the fence about it, maybe just do a yes and to some of those things.
Yeah, I agree. We have to think a little bit more out of the box and more creatively than I think we've had to in the past. We've been able to take for granted that, our government won't run off the rails. And at least speaking for myself, for decades of that, of taking it for granted. And we can't anymore. So it calls for
Yeah.
some additional activity, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing. I mean, with that additional activity, it's really important to stay grounded. I think a lot of us realize this now, and the fact that this is a long-term issue, right? And it's something that, I mean, by the end of my lifetime, I don't think we'll be out of some of these current problems we're in completely. So we have to stay oriented toward the fact that it's a really long struggle, just like a lot of struggles for justice and equality and such have been.
Very true. Very true. Well, Stephen, I really appreciate you saying yes and joining us. And, I want to stay in touch with your work. Please let us know how we can do that. And, again, congratulations on all that you've done. As I mentioned before, check out Stephen's Substack, stephenwaldron.substack.com. Any last thoughts?
Just thank you so much, Brian. I'm really glad you're having these conversations with people.
No, thank you. It's helpful for me, to get through trying times. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Brian.